I'm diving into what makes Egon Schiele's art so distinct and how you can capture that unique intensity in your own style. You'll see my process of recreating two of his iconic pieces and how I created Schiele's raw angular energy into my final portrait. This video isn't just about studying a master, it's about learning how to take what connects with you and shape it into your own artistic voice. Stick around to see how studying Schiele can inspire you to set your own creative boundaries and push your art forward. Before diving into his history, I'd like to share with you the process of creating this study. So first, I sketched it out with graphite pencil, and then I created two different colors of orange. One is Schmincke's chrome orange, and the other is more red from Winsor & Newton called the transparent orange. So I created tons of textures because when you look closely at the painting, you can see that he uses a lot of textures within that orange sweater. So I'm creating that with this flat brush from Craftomo of Emily Hughes. I just love it. And then next I start getting into the hair. So I tapped in some oranges, but also you can see greens and there's some purple. So I added a bit of that with watercolor. And then with my micron pen, I started layering that lines within. And I realized that he uses, I think, different thickness of lines. So some were really thin and some were thicker than the others. So I was trying to be mindful here. But I believe the hand, those linear works in the hand is very important. So I made sure I did that correctly. And then I went in with like a thinner line micro pen around here. Kind of created some textures. A lot of the lines were really like sketchy. They weren't like really straight. They were more loose. So I try to recreate that as well. But one thing I would say is that I used a white gouache on top of that around the collar, which I think wasn't correct. So I'll be doing something about that later. I should have just used a background tint to kind of seep through. And then using a graphite pencil, I went over more marks because I just thought the pen wouldn't quite do it. I also used some of that cadmium-ish color pencils for places like the forehead and the lips, but it didn't quite look like the painting, so I thought I'll figure that out later. So I'm working into more of those lines, those really delicate lines with the graphite, although I do think that the graphite didn't give as much of the darkish lines as I wanted to. I should have used a pencil, but regardless, it's good to use a graphite pencil just to make sure that you're getting the right values and things are in place. So I'm kind of going darker here. I'm putting a lot of marks on the hair because that's what I saw on the painting. And then I'm getting in darker and darker with the values. And eventually I'm using some watercolor like greens and purples, because when you look at the painting really closely, you can see these tiny hints of colors all around his face as well as his hands. So I'm trying to depict that in this study as well. And right here, I see a very thick purple line. Used smalt from Winsor & Newton, but I think dioxazine purple would have been a better choice actually because you can get really dark. But there's like a dark line between his clothes and his hands, so I try to put that. And here again, I'm putting all those colors that I see, those really subtle colors within his face and his hand. And his hair. Now I'm layering some colors in his hair as well. So it was a lot of tweaking here and there because it's so soft. So I'm adjusting as I go. And eventually I used cadmium red, which I kind of think topped it off for those reddishness in his knuckles. And finally I go with my graphite pencil to darken some areas and create more texture within the sweater, so then I can go over it finally with the micro pen. So I liked how Egon Schiele had his rectangles on the right hand side and wrote his name within the rectangle. So here I did it with my own name, but I used a graphite pencil before I committed fully to a micro pen. And again, I tried to use the color pencils that was close to cadmium red, but it was just not the right color. So again, I decided to use the cadmium red from Schminke for those areas near the lips and his knuckles, his fingers, and also his other hand at the bottom as well, and called it a day. And I think I love how this piece turned out. So for the second study, I chose Standing Male Nude by Egon Schiele. And first I used some leftover paint to create the tinted paper look for this one as well, using gouache. And then next, I chose specific colors from my gouache palette to create the skin tone close enough to what he used, using permanent green, yellow ochre, as well as some whites and cadmium reds to create like a desaturated skin tone, but leaning towards the green. But my mistake here was that I should have created more of them in more like a wide variety, as in more reddish or greenish or more towards the whitish, beigeish look, because what happened was that as I went forward, I didn't have any more paints left, and you know, if you're using gouache, that you have to mix in those colors like enough to cover the whole area. And I just thought, I'll be okay, and I kind of continued with it. And then I had to go back and try to recreate those colors, which I really couldn't. And I was like, yeah, my mental state was somewhere else. I just didn't feel like doing it. So you would see me eventually, after I lay down quite a lot, that I will use a very watery, consistent wash of these gouache colors, which then when you lay that on top of the next layer, it just like diffuses into the bottom layer, because you have to get creamy, right? As you lay over gouache, it's just like a bit like oil painting. It's lean over fat. You will see how the pigment kind of like just gets consumed by the underneath layer. But anyhow, I started off with just going randomly into areas that had different shades of colors. I don't know really how I worked my, like what the order was. I just went with my gut feeling of what kind of felt right and what felt fun doing. I just laid down these different skin tones. So you can see in the elbow, it's more reddish towards the reddish brownish color, and it's darker than his back per se, because if you kind of relatively look at it, his back, the curve that's right there, is quite greenish, and the more you get closer to his armpit, it's like more whitish. So that's the kind of, I just split those skin tones into sections, and I'm trying to work my way around. The linear kind of paint marks that I put is more to say, okay, there's like a darkish tone right here. So I'm just trying to get the visual feeling of what kind of changes would happen, like where it should go darker and so forth. But I really enjoyed this process. It was just really fun creating those skin tones. But I think I really went too green for this look. Yeah. Maybe it could have also been the color that I chose for the background is quite orangey compared to the real tint of the paper he used. So that could have added to kind of making the green even look more greener than it is. But regardless, it was fun. And then here I'm trying to use a graphite, my pearl wing pencil, to go inside some darker areas, which later I will be using the hard pastel that I have right on the left-hand side behind my phone. So here I'm going in more darker with my graphite pencil, trying to get those really important angular lines. And then here I'm using darker gouache, like blacks and grays, to go inside those areas of the contour lines of some of his fingers, as well as his eye line. And then here I'm kind of realizing, oh shoot, I need more of those skin tones. So everything I lay down is kind of getting gulped up by the underneath layer because I'm using a lot of water. I'm also adding that gouache onto his hair, but leaving some bits untouched, because eventually what I did was I used those hard pastels on the left. I used the black to create those like textures in his hair with the strands. But unfortunately, I lost the whole footage onwards. Anyhow, I enjoyed the process. For the final portrait, I just knew exactly which photo reference I wanted to use, because basically he's the first in my Masters Reimagined series where I had the access to an actual close-up photo of him. However, there wasn't any of him where he was without clothes, because I wanted to explore the angularity of his body more, but since I didn't have that, I decided to use one that included a hand, because I feel like a lot of Schiele's striking pieces often had his hand, and it shows that tension and vulnerability, so I chose to do that. Here again, I'm tinting the paper with watercolor this time around, using transparent orange mixed with hematite genuine violet, which is from the Prima Tech of Daniel Smith. And then I sketched the piece again, including the death's head hawk moth, because I just feel like this is the best moth that kind of ties in with Schiele, because he often explored life and death in his works. I'm going into his hair using lapis brown, which is a color from Rockwell, which I absolutely adore as well. And I worked in using a triadic color palette. And it's interesting because I used Palette Scout, which I used here and there for some of my works. And it's been such a joy using these, because I noticed that in the works that I absolutely love from Egon Schiele, he used the triadic color palette. And when you look at this Palette Scout and you select the color that you absolutely need to include in a painting per se, I can look at at an instant what the triadic colors are, and I can take out those color swatches and kind of look at what the color palette would be. So I've chosen for this, at the top you can see the orange on the left, and then the purples and the greens, because those are the colors that he uses time and time again. It was the same thing for the 2 other portraits. So that's what I worked on, and I started layering in his face, his jacket. I chose orange to use because I just felt like orange is his color. And yeah, as I worked on the portrait, the piece started to take on a bit of Francis Bacon vibe, maybe because of the rawness and psychological tension that Schiele's work shares with Bacon's. There was something about the colors and the way the figure developed that made it feel like it could almost belong in a Halloween setting with its eerie, vibrant palette. It was interesting how this kind of emotional and psychological feeling kind of kept evolving as I added layers to the piece. Another thing I would mention about this portrait is that his face is not that angular. Like, it's not as very sharp. His face was actually quite like round. But because I know Egon Schiele's work often consisted of those like exaggerated angularity, I kind of made it more angular around his cheekbone and his jawline. And here, of course, you can't miss out on those fingers, because that's quite an important bit of his works that I've so far kind of looked at that I really loved. So I added some of those oranges on his knuckles again and went darker with his jacket that he was wearing with the orange. And here, I just felt like something was lacking, and I just wanted to put more of my own kind of style. So I got the big flat brush and I created these vertical lines. Again, maybe I should have left it at this stage, but you'll see me fiddling with it quite a bit. So yeah. But regardless, I really enjoyed this piece. I did kind of continuing layering it with the oranges. Even for the moth, the brooch that I put on, I just felt like it was lacking color. So eventually I'll cover it with some of those same orange of the jacket. And I will add in a lot of lines with graphite, again, as well as the pen and charcoal in his hair to kind of give it that Egon Schiele signature look. I kind of want to go over some of Egon Schiele's history that I find very interesting. He was born in 1890 in Austria and had a complicated relationship with a lot of his family members. His father died when Schiele was young, only around 14 or 15, I believe, and his mother, who had a difficult relationship with him, seemed to influence his artistic development. And Schiele's father, Max Schiele, died in 1900, likely due to complications related to syphilis, which was a disease he had contracted earlier in life. And this loss had a great impact on Schiele, who was really young at the time. Schiele's own battle with syphilis in his early 20s, a sexually transmitted disease, added a layer, I believe, of complexity to his preoccupation with themes around death and sexuality in his work. He had a very strange relationship with his sister, Gertrude. I'll call here on Gertie. They were extremely close, and Gertie often modeled for his works. But there was something very strange. When Schiele was 16, he took 12-year-old Gertie on a train trip, where they spent the night in a hotel room, but Gertie later referred to the experience as something that could never be spoken of, which raises questions about the nature of their relationship. Schiele was an apprentice under Klimt, and though they were both revolutionary, their approaches to art were vastly different. My love for Klimt's refined sensual beauty, his golden layers and ornamental patterns made me realize that Schiele, despite his raw and unflinching style, had absorbed aspects of Klimt's work early on. Schiele's focus on the imperfection and fragility of the human body through angular poses and psychological depth set him apart, but you can still see Klimt's influence in Schiele's early pieces. Over time, Schiele rebelled against the more decorative elements of Klimt's style, moving towards a more raw emotional expression and rejecting the elegance of Klimt's idealized forms. Ultimately, Schiele's work taught me that it's okay to embrace the rawness in my own art. This ability to capture human vulnerability, to go beyond surface beauty and reveal the complex emotions underneath is something I find incredibly inspiring. What really stood out to me in his work was the way he used pencils and line work to convey depth and emotion. That's something that I've been exploring in my own pieces. But seeing Schiele's approach just made me realize how powerful simple pencil lines can be in bringing out the emotional core of a figure. His work is a reminder that true art comes from a place of honest expression, even if it's kind of uncomfortable for both the artist and the viewer. It's that discomfort that gives his work so much power. And I'm hoping to get to a place where I can convey that same rawness and honesty in my own art just as strongly as Schiele did.